let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're breaking down the profound psychological and thematic matrix of Shakespeare's absolute masterpiece, Othello. Now, we are moving way beyond a simple plot summary here. We're going to look really closely at the underlying mechanics of the play to understand exactly how meaning, truth, and identity are meticulously constructed and then, quite frankly, ruthlessly destroyed. So, whether you're a longtime Shakespeare enthusiast or just fascinated by human psychology, there is incredibly rich material here about just how vulnerable our sense of self really is. To make sense of all this dense textual analysis, we are going to follow a specific thematic arc today. 1. Language as identity. 2. The mechanics of manipulation. 3. The fragility of truth. 4. Internalizing prejudice. And finally, 5. Final words and silence. All right, starting off with section 1, language as identity. Shakespeare brilliantly uses rhetoric as a direct mirror for Othello's own sense of selfhood. Just look at the start of the play. Othello is the absolute picture of emotional balance. When he's accused of using witchcraft to win his wife, Desdemona, he doesn't panic, not at all. He uses logical, vivid storytelling to command respect and reinforce his noble identity, right there before the Venetian Senate. His sentences are long, flowing, and incredibly persuasive. Basically, his language proves to everyone and to himself that he is a confident, rational leader. In the world of this play, your ability to speak with control is directly tied to your very identity. But notice the stark contrast later on. As Iago's toxic manipulation really takes hold of his mind, that beautiful, measured eloquence, it completely shatters. By Act 4, his speech degenerates into broken syntax, frantic repetition, and stuttering. Lie with her? Lie on her? It's literally the sound of a mind struggling to distinguish truth from illusion. And this linguistic deterioration actually culminates physically in an epileptic fit. It perfectly symbolizes the total, devastating collapse of his noble self-image. When Othello loses control of his words, he totally loses his grip on who he is. Moving right along to Section 2, the mechanics of manipulation. And this brings us to the real catalyst of the tragedy, which is Iago's psychological warfare. I am not what I am. This famously deceptive line, spoken so early in the play, establishes his terrifying hypocrisy right off the bat. By twisting the biblical phrase, I am that I am, Iago sets up the central, fatal conflict of the entire story. That incredibly dangerous gap between appearance and reality. He's explicitly telling us that he's going to weaponize deception. The crucial thing to remember here is that Iago doesn't just casually lie. No, he follows this meticulous, step-by-step psychological process to embed anxiety deep into Othello's mind. Step 1. He doesn't invent Othello's insecurities. He exploits the ones that are already there, his age, his race, and his status as a foreigner in Venice. Step 2. He takes totally innocent realities and twists them. For example, reminding Othello that Desdemona kept her marriage a secret from her father, planting that little seed that she's perfectly capable of deception. Finally, step 3. He uses these doubts to weaponize circumstantial evidence, suggesting their love is inherently unnatural. Today, we'd absolutely call this a textbook case of gaslighting, but it remains a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, the fragility of truth. To truly grasp how Iago weaponizes evidence, we have to look at how a simple prop becomes this ultimate tool of destruction. Think about the literal journey of the handkerchief across these characters. For Othello, it's a sacred symbol of love and trust. Then, Desdemona accidentally loses it. Amelia finds it, just viewing it as a trivial item. But then, Iago takes it, instantly transforming it into an instrument of deception. Finally, it ends up with Cassio, where Othello views it as absolute, undeniable evidence of infidelity. The crazy thing is, the handkerchief itself never changes, right? But its meaning shifts drastically depending on who happens to be holding it. The key takeaway here is how terrifyingly easy it is to distort evidence. Truth, in this tragedy, relies entirely on interpretation rather than objective facts. Let's get into Section 4, internalizing the prejudice. Because, let's face it, circumstantial evidence alone isn't going to break a seasoned military general. The tragedy truly kicks into high gear when Othello starts absorbing the toxic environment around him. While Iago starts the play using very open, vulgar racism, like calling Othello an old black ram just to agitate Desdemona's father, his ultimate victory is far more insidious. Othello eventually states, happily for I am black, actively questioning his own worth. Iago's greatest, most destructive triumph is getting Othello to internalize Venetian society's prejudice and actually use it against himself. The racism completely transforms from an external attack into this internal psychological force. And how does he achieve this internal collapse? By planting these seemingly innocent little reminders. He exploits those exact insecurities, leading Othello to view his own marriage as an aberration, an unnatural pairing. He literally convinces Othello that Desdemona will inevitably wake up, realize she made a huge mistake, and seek someone more socially acceptable in Venice. It's so devastating because Iago uses Othello's own mind as the weapon against him. Now, in the face of all this manipulation, we absolutely have to talk about Desdemona. It is vital to note that her later passivity in the play isn't some weird contradiction of her early confidence. Think about it. She courageously defies her father, and she intelligently defends her marriage early on. Later, she remains incredibly patiently loyal despite Othello's wild accusations. These actions all stem from the exact same unwavering moral integrity and duty to her marriage. It's so ironic, but it's her own total innocence that tragically prevents her from understanding Othello's sudden jealousy. Because she is completely incapable of betrayal, she literally cannot fathom that she's genuinely being suspected of it. Finally, we arrive at section 5, final words and silence. This brings us to the aftermath, where the whole structure of language just completely collapses. When Iago's horrific plots are finally dragged into the light, he absolutely refuses to give us, or the other characters, any closure whatsoever. He simply says, "Demand me nothing. What you know, you know." By abruptly refusing to explain his true motives, Iago forces a massive shift in our focus. We stop asking why evil exists, and instead we are forced to stare directly at the devastating consequences of what evil actually does. His silence makes him infinitely more frightening because it completely resists our deep human need for a rational explanation. Now, in stark contrast to that silence from Iago, Othello desperately tries to reclaim his narrative right at the end. Before taking his own life, he frames himself as a tragic lover, a man who simply loved too much, rather than a man who foolishly abandoned his reason for baseless suspicion. He wants history to remember his deep emotion, not his absolutely catastrophic lack of judgment. And it's exactly because of that final speech that literary scholars are so deeply divided. On one side, we have A.C. Bradley, who sees a man finally achieving authentic redemption. Bradley argues that Othello accepts accountability and that his suicide restores his lost dignity. But on the flip side, F.R. Leavis argues that this speech proves Othello is still deeply, deeply flawed. Leavis sees a man who is self-dramatizing, dodging the full ugly weight of his responsibility, and is still selfishly obsessed with constructing a heroic image of himself for posterity. But you know what the absolute genius of Shakespeare's writing is here? It's recognizing that both of these interpretations are actually true at the exact same time. Human beings are incredibly complex. Othello feels authentic, crushing guilt, and yet he still engages in lingering self-deception to soften the blow to his ego. He isn't wholly noble and he isn't wholly selfish at the very end. He is just painfully, realistically human. So, as you process the psychological matrix we've unpacked in this explainer today, from the fragile nature of identity all the way to the devastating power of internalized prejudice, I want to leave you with this lingering thought to chew on. Does Iago's haunting final silence suggest that our human need to find a logical, rational reason for cruelty is itself a tragic flaw? Think about that the next time you try to make sense of the senseless. Until next time, keep questioning the text.